Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, September 14, 1944. 6:47 a.m. A German woman pressed her back against the wooden wall of a shower hut in the middle of America's heartland and screamed. Not from pain, not from a guard's fist. She screamed because water was falling from the pipes above her head. Hot water, clean water, real water. And in 1944, for a woman pulled from the ruins of war-torn Europe, a shower room didn't mean hygiene. It meant death. 36 German women had just stepped off a rattling truck in the Oklahoma flatlands. Former secretaries, nurses, telephone operators, Wehrmacht auxiliaries. They had crossed a bombed-out continent, survived a sick ocean voyage, and arrived at a place called Camp Tonkawa, a name that tasted foreign on their tongues. They had been told in whispers, passed like contraband through prison transports, that the Americans would finish what the war had started. Gas chambers, medical experiments. No one comes back, and now a guard was pointing them toward the showers. What happened next inside that wooden hut shook every woman in that room to the marrow. And by the time they walked back out, wet-haired, red-eyed, wrapped in U.S. Army towels, nothing would ever be the same again. The wind over Oklahoma that morning came in dry and cold, scraping across the red dirt plains like a blade. It did not feel like freedom. Along the narrow dirt road leading to the barbed wire gates of Camp Tonkawa, the transport trucks rattled like old bones. Inside, the 36 women sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, wearing threadbare field gray uniforms stamped with a single word, Kriegsgefangene, prisoner of war. Their eyes stayed down. Nobody spoke. These women had not picked up rifles. They had not commanded troops or drawn battle maps. They had typed letters, answered phones, cataloged medical supplies, stitched wounds in field hospitals. Some had been widowed by Allied bombs. Some were barely 20 years old. All of them had been swept up in the machinery of a war that chewed through human beings without distinguishing between those who chose it and those who simply survived it. They had been processed through bombed-out France, loaded onto a transport ship at gunpoint, and delivered across an ocean to a country their propaganda had painted as monstrous. And the rumors had started before they even boarded the ship. You know what Americans do to prisoners. The same thing they say we did. Gas chambers, medical experiments. You go in and you don't come out. Some of these whispers came from fellow prisoners. Others had been seeded years earlier by Nazi propaganda films, grainy reels that showed America as a land of degeneracy and savagery, a Jewish-controlled empire that had no use for mercy. And some of the fear came from pure human logic. We did terrible things. Why would they not repay in kind? So when the truck doors swung open at Camp Tonkawa and American guards barked orders in a language none of them fully understood, nobody moved. Then a second voice cut through, calm, measured, a woman speaking in soft, clear German. Bitte steigen Sie aus. You are safe. A translator. She wore a Red Cross armband. Half German, half traitor, some would mutter later. But in that moment, she was a hand reaching into darkness. The women descended one by one. What met them was not what fear had built in their minds. The camp was clean, orderly. Long wooden barracks, a mess hall, a patch of dusty green where laundry lines flapped in the wind. No machine gun towers, no snarling dogs. American guards, mostly young farm boys in clean khaki, kept their rifles slung and their eyes carefully averted. The silence was not cruel, but it was unreadable. And silence without cruelty was almost harder to endure than violence with a clear purpose, because violence could be understood. This could not. During processing, their possessions were itemized quietly. Combs, crucifixes, dried flowers, handkerchiefs stitched with names. One woman had a child's drawing folded into her bra. Another had kept a small cake of German soap wrapped in wax paper, hoarded across an ocean like gold. They were given new uniforms, simple tan cotton too large. Metal tags stamped POW with a number. Their names were recorded by a man who never raised his voice. Then the order came. All new arrivals proceed to showers. The phrase hit the room like a current through wet hands. One woman gasped, Another backed against the wall. Several clutched each other without thinking. Because in 1944, for women who had passed near Poland, who had seen photographs smuggled from the East, who had heard the word Zyklon spoken in shaking voices around campfires, the word showers was not an instruction. It was a sentence. Auschwitz, Majdanek, Bergen-Belsen. Fake showerheads that delivered not water, but death. The rumors had passed even through the Wehrmacht's own ranks. Some denied them. Some chose not to believe. But all feared them. A nurse named Martha from Dresden stepped forward and whispered in German, "Do we get to write a letter first?" The American guard didn't understand. He just gestured again. "Move along." The translator stepped between them instantly. She spoke carefully, her voice steady. "You are not in danger. These are real showers. Hot water. Soap. Towels." Still nobody moved. One woman began to sob with her shoulders making no sound, and then a single figure stepped forward. Her name was Ilsa. She had cleaned surgical tools in an army hospital near Hamburg. She had buried her husband after an Allied bombing raid in 1943. She had survived famine and fire and one miscarriage in a blackout shelter. She was 31 years old and had not felt warmth from another human hand in longer than she could remember. It took everything she had to push open the wooden door of that shower hut. What she found destroyed her. Modern clean slatted floors, pipes overhead with real shower heads, folded towels on a wooden bench, bars of brown soap stamped U.S. Army Square and honest. And then, the water came hot, immediate real, and it hit her shoulders and her neck, and it thawed something so deep inside her that her legs simply gave way. She slid down the wall to the floor, pressed both hands over her face, and wept. Not the quiet weeping of grief. The shaking, total collapse of a person whose entire understanding of the world has just been torn out by the root. One by one the others followed through the door. One by one they found the same thing. Clean water, heat, no screaming, no gas, no death. Outside, the farm boy guards waited in silence, rifles lowered looking at the ground. Inside, the cries began to echo through the steam, not screams of pain, but something harder to name. The sound of a wall coming down. Of years of constructed terror meeting a single act of ordinary decency and shattering. Gertrude, who had worked in a bank in Bavaria and knew numbers better than she knew people, stared up at the showerhead as steam curled around her. "It's only water," she whispered. But that was not true. It was the absence of death. And the absence of something long anticipated, something the body has already made room for, something the mind has accepted, lands harder than its presence. They had made space inside themselves for annihilation. Instead, they had been given soap. For Sabine, barely 20, trained in a typing school in Bremen and assigned to the Reich's administrative operations, the hot water was the first gentle thing a uniformed institution had ever given her. She dropped the soap and fell to her knees on the wooden slats, her hair plastered to her cheeks, sobbing from somewhere deep in the stomach. She had been told her body existed for service. Her worth was measured in keystrokes per minute in obedience and silence. This hot water, freely given a clean cloth laid out without demand, was the first moment of grace she could remember. And then, Erica. The woman who had kept her son's drawing hidden in her clothing since her arrest said the thing none of them had the courage to form into words. Her voice broke as she spoke. "If this is how they treat enemies, then what does that make us?" Nobody answered. The steam thickened. It blurred the walls. It blurred the scars. A hush came down over the room like snow. When they emerged, wrapped in towels, hair dripping, eyes swollen, they did not look at the guards. But they no longer stared only at the ground either. They were given new uniforms. Softer fabric fitted better, no stains. Clean undergarments. Clean socks. Blankets folded on their bunks. Tin mugs with warm milk. All of it delivered without a single raised voice. That night in barracks, 3C, no one spoke of what had happened in the shower hut. But none of them slept easily either. Ilsa sat on her bunk and lifted her hands to her face and inhaled the scent of American soap. She had thought she would be stripped shaved, marched into death. Instead, someone had given her back her name. Sabine lay with the blanket pulled to her chin, eyes open in the dark, asking the same question over and over in her mind. Why would they waste hot water on us? Why would they use real soap? Why would they be kind if they hated us? The moon rose over the Oklahoma prairie and sent blue light through the high window slats, and the room full of women who had been enemies lay still, not sleeping, but no longer afraid. Something had passed through them that night, not spoken, not explained, only felt. The war they had been carrying inside their bodies, the war built from propaganda and fear, and years of iron certainty had cracked. Because the lie had been warm and familiar and protective. And the truth was harder to survive than the lie ever was. The truth had heat, and with heat comes the ache of thawing after a long, long freeze. 3 weeks later, something would happen at a civilian farm 7 miles from the camp that would break what the shower had only cracked. A widow named Mabel Clayton, whose son James had died in a tank in Tunisia at age 21, would hand a German prisoner a jar of cold lemonade and kneel in the dirt to help her gather spilled grain. She would look that prisoner in the eye, not as an enemy, not as a number, and say 2 words that would echo through the barracks for the rest of the war. "You're welcome." But that morning was still coming. For now, in the dark, Ilsa pressed her soap-scented hands to her face and closed her eyes. For the first time since 1939, she did not see the face of a dead man when she did. She did not sleep peacefully, but she slept. The kind of sleep that arrives not from victory, but from the exhaustion of surviving your own hatred. And somewhere in the darkness of Barracks 3C, the first wall had already begun to fall. 36 German women had arrived in chains and left the shower hut weeping not from pain, but from the violence of unexpected mercy. Hot water, real soap, folded towels. The wall built from years of Nazi propaganda had cracked in a single morning. But cracking a wall and tearing it down are 2 entirely different things. Because outside Barracks, 3C beyond the barbed wire, beyond the flat red plains of Oklahoma, a different battle was being fought. Not with rifles, not with bombs, but with clipboards, regulations, and men in pressed uniforms who had decided that German prisoners, especially women, deserved exactly nothing. In the fall of 1944, the United States held over 400,000 Axis prisoners on American soil. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment. But humane was a word that stretched differently depending on who was doing the stretching. And for one Army administrator named Colonel James Whitfield Pratt, humane meant breadwater and silence. It absolutely did not mean hot showers, donated blankets, or Baptist women sending Bibles to the enemy. And Pratt was about to make that very clear. Colonel Pratt arrived at Camp Tonkawa on a Tuesday morning in October with a leather briefcase and the expression of a man who had already made up his mind. He was 53 years old, a career officer from Virginia, and he had spent 22 years building a reputation for efficiency and zero tolerance for what he called sentimental interference. He sat across from Camp Commander Major William Harrelson and opened the briefcase without looking up. "I've received reports," Pratt said, "that prisoners in the women's barracks have received donated goods from civilian sources. Blankets, religious texts, personal hygiene items beyond standard issue." Harrelson nodded slowly. "That's correct, sir. The Tulsa Women's Guild organized the donation. The Red Cross approved the transfer." "The Red Cross," Pratt said, finally looking up, "does not run this camp. I do. And I will not have American civilians cozying up to the women who supported the regime that killed their sons. With respect, Colonel, several of those women sending blankets lost sons in this war. They made that choice themselves." Pratt closed the briefcase. "Sentimentality is a security risk, Major. These are enemy combatants. The moment we treat them like guests, we invite manipulation, communication breaches, and propaganda opportunities for Berlin. Pull the donated items. restrict letter writing to 1 communication per quarter, and the farm labor program suspended effective immediately. Harrelson said nothing for a long moment. Outside through the office window, he could see the women of Barracks 3C crossing the yard for morning work detail backs, straight heads up, moving with a dignity that had not been there 6 weeks ago. He turned back to Pratt. "Sir, the labor program is producing results. Farm output in the county is up 23% since we started. The women work hard. The farmers request them specifically." I said suspended. Guy. The meeting ended in 4 minutes. Harrelson walked back to his office, sat down and stared at his desk for a long time. He had 2 options: follow orders and watch 36 women retreat back into the silence and fear they had started to climb out of, or find another way. He chose the second option. And the man he called that afternoon would change everything. His name was Captain Edward Faulkner, Red Cross liaison, former sociology professor from the University of Chicago, and the only man in the Oklahoma POW administrative network who had actually read the full Geneva Convention text, rather than summarizing it for a briefing. Faulkner was 41, thin, perpetually ink-stained at the fingertips, and widely regarded by career officers as a nuisance. He arrived at Camp Tonkawa the following morning with a stack of documents 2 inches thick, and a quiet absolute certainty that Pratt was wrong. "Article 17, Faulkner said, spreading papers across Harrelson's desk. "Prisoners must be allowed to receive individual parcels. Article 26 guarantees canteen access and personal hygiene provisions above minimum standard when available. The farm labor program falls under Article 27, intellectual and recreational activity. Pratt can't touch any of it without violating our own treaty obligations." Harrelson looked at the papers. "He outranks me by 2 grades. "He does," Faulkner said. "But the State Department outranks him, and right now the State Department is very interested in how we treat German POWs, because the Germans are holding 95,000 American prisoners. Every decision we make here gets mirrored on the other side of the Atlantic. Pratt cuts blankets from Barracks 3C, and a senator in Washington hears about it within a week." Harrelson looked up slowly. "You're going to make this political." "I'm going to make it visible," Faulkner said. "There's a difference." They had exactly 1 opportunity. Faulkner had arranged for a delegation from the International Red Cross to conduct a formal inspection of Camp Tonkawa on November 3rd, 12 days away. If the camp could demonstrate a functioning Geneva-compliant rehabilitation program with measurable outcomes, Pratt's interference would be overruled from above. If it failed, if the women regressed, if there were incidents, if the numbers didn't hold, Pratt would get everything he wanted. 1 chance, 12 days. And the stakes were not just blankets and soap dishes. They were the invisible line between humiliation and humanity. The next 12 days moved fast and quietly. Helen Baumgartner, the translator, worked 18-hour shifts, processing letters, organizing the farm work schedule, documenting every measurable outcome she could find. The women's labor productivity had increased 31% over 6 weeks. Incidents of infirmary visits, which often reflected psychological stress in POW populations, had dropped from 11 per week to 3. Letter correspondence had produced 0 security breaches in 8 weeks of operation. These were not feelings. These were numbers, and numbers were the only language Pratt's superiors actually spoke. In Barracks 3C, the women sensed the tension without being told. Ilsa noticed the change in Helen's face, the tightness around the jaw, the speed of her walk. "Something is being decided about us," Ilsa told Gertrude one evening. Gertrude, who had spent years in a bank reading the micro-expressions of men negotiating other people's money, nodded. "Yes, and we are not the ones deciding it." That night, without any instruction from the guards, the women cleaned the barracks floor to a shine. They arranged the soap dishes, folded every blanket with military precision, aligned the small shrine of photographs and paper flowers at Der Winkel with geometric exactness. They could not attend the meeting. They could not argue their case. But they could make the argument visible in every surface that the inspectors would see. November 3rd arrived gray and cold. The Red Cross delegation, 3 men in civilian suits with Swiss-German accents and clipboards, walked through the camp for 4 hours. Pratt stood to one side throughout, rigid and silent, watching. Faulkner walked with the delegation, answering questions in a flat, factual voice, handing over documentation at the precise moment each number was mentioned. Barracks 3C was the last stop. The delegation entered. They moved slowly through the room. One man stopped at Der Winkel, the small shelf where photographs, buttons, handwritten notes, and one bent tin soap dish sat arranged with careful human intention. He leaned forward and read the handwritten note tucked beneath a dried pecan leaf. "I am not what they told me I had to be." He did not speak for a moment. Then he turned to Pratt and said in careful English, "Colonel, this is not a prison. This is a rehabilitation. The difference is significant." He made a note on his clipboard. "We will be recommending this camp as a model facility in our report to Geneva." Pratt said nothing. The muscle in his jaw moved once. The farm labor program was restored within 48 hours. Letter writing remained monthly. The donated goods stayed on the shelves, and Colonel Pratt returned to his office in Tulsa and did not visit Camp Tonkawa again. Harrelson called Faulkner that evening with the news. Faulkner received it without celebration. "Good," he said quietly. "Now make sure they deserve it." The numbers, when Faulkner compiled them for the final Red Cross report, told a story that no propaganda film had ever been designed to tell. 36 women, 8 weeks, 0 escape attempts, 0 security incidents, a 31% increase in labor productivity, an infirmary visit rate lower than many standard U.S. Army training camps, and 1 tin soap dish made from the bottom of a discarded mess tin that an international delegation had photographed for their report to Geneva. But here is what the numbers could not capture. On the night of November 3rd, after the delegation left and the outcome was still unknown, Sabine sat at the edge of her bunk and wrote in her hidden journal, "Today felt like a trial. Not of what we did, but of what we might yet become. I think we passed. I don't know what that means for tomorrow, but I know what it means for tonight. It means we are still here, still learning, still becoming." She closed the journal and looked at the mirror on her bedside table. Scratched metal, imperfect reflection, absolutely honest. She looked at her own face for a long time. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that a letter from Gertrude's brother Karl, a Wehrmacht officer on the Eastern Front, had just arrived at the camp's mail processing office. Inside, in careful handwriting, was a single question that would force every woman in Barracks 3C to make the most difficult choice of their lives. "If the Americans are truly as kind as the rumors say, then I need you to help me surrender to them." The war had just come back through the mail slot, and now Barracks 3C was no longer just a story about healing. It was a story about what happens when healing becomes dangerous. 36 women had arrived in fear and discovered mercy. A tin soap dish had become a flag. A cracked mirror had given back their faces. And a Red Cross inspection had buried Colonel Pratt's cruelty under a stack of Geneva Convention articles. Barracks 3C had become something no military planner had ever designed it to be: a laboratory for what happens when enemies are treated as human beings. But now a letter had arrived from the Eastern Front. Gertrude's brother Karl, a Wehrmacht junior officer somewhere near the frozen edge of the Soviet advance, had written 7 words that changed everything. "Help me surrender to the Americans." 1 letter, 1 request. And suddenly, the women of Barracks 3C were no longer just prisoners learning to heal. They were potential intelligence assets, political symbols, and depending on who found out, security risks. Camp Tonkawa's commanding staff received Karl's letter within 48 hours of its arrival. Military intelligence protocol required it. What nobody had anticipated was the speed of what followed. Within 72 hours of that letter reaching Major Harrelson's desk, 3 separate Army intelligence officers arrived at the camp unannounced. They were not interested in blankets or soap dishes or the emotional rehabilitation of German auxiliaries. They wanted to know exactly what Gertrude had written to her brother. They wanted to know if she had communicated military information. They wanted to know if the entire letter-writing program had been from the beginning a security vulnerability dressed up as humanitarian policy. Colonel Pratt's office in Tulsa sent a memo the same day. It contained 4 words: "I told you so." The interrogation of Gertrude lasted 6 hours. She sat across a metal table from 2 intelligence officers who took turns asking the same questions in different sequences. What did you tell him about the camp layout? What did you tell him about American troop movements? What code words did you use? Gertrude, who had spent 20 years reading the faces of men trying to hide what they owed, answered each question with the same flat precision. I told him I was alive. I told him I was safe. I told him the Americans did not hate us. She folded her hands on the table and did not look away. That is all I told him, and apparently that was enough to make him want to come here. The intelligence officers left without charging her, but the damage was already spreading through the camp like cold air through a broken window. Letter writing was suspended immediately. The farm labor program was paused pending review. Helen Baumgartner was pulled from her translator duties for 3 days of debriefing. And in Barracks 3C, the women felt the walls tighten again, not physically, but in the way that institutions have of communicating disapproval without speaking it. The guards were quieter. The meals arrived without the occasional extra ladle of oatmeal. The chapel piano sat untouched for 11 days. Ilsa watched it happen and recognized the mechanism. They are afraid of what we proved, she told Sabine one night. Not afraid of us. Afraid of the idea that kindness works. Because if kindness works, then everything they built this war on starts to wobble. Sabine looked at the mirror on her bedside table. Then we have to keep proving it. The crisis broke open on December 2, 1944, when Carl's response arrived not through the Red Cross, but through U.S. Army intelligence, which had been monitoring his unit's communication frequencies for 6 weeks. Carl had not waited for Gertrude's help. Acting on the belief that the Americans at Camp Tonkawa represented something real, he had walked to his commanding officer's tent on a Tuesday morning, laid his rifle on the ground outside, and told 3 men in his unit what he intended to do. 2 of them joined him. All 3 walked west through frozen ground for 19 hours and surrendered to an American forward position near Aachen. They were alive. They were unharmed. And in their initial debriefing, Carl had provided information about Wehrmacht defensive positions along a 12-kilometer stretch of the German frontier that American planners had been trying to map for 3 months. 3 men, 19 hours of walking, and intelligence that would directly inform the planning of what became known as Operation Grenade, the American crossing of the Roer River in February 1945. When Harrelson told Gertrude what her brother had done, she sat completely still for 40 seconds. Then she said very quietly, "He believed me." Harrelson nodded. He did. Gertrude pressed both hands flat on the table. Then the letters worked. Not as security threats, as the opposite. She looked up. "We convinced 1 man that Americans were worth surrendering to. He convinced 2 more. And those 3 men walked 19 hours through snow because of what happened in this camp." She paused. How is that a liability? Harrelson had no answer because she was right. The intelligence report that landed on Army desks in Washington in December 1944 did not use the words kindness or rehabilitation. It used words like voluntary defection, facilitation, and psychological influence operation. But it described the same thing. A camp in Oklahoma where German prisoners had been treated with basic human dignity and had in response begun actively encouraging other Germans to surrender. The report noted that in the 6 weeks following Carl's defection, American forward positions near Aachen reported a 40% increase in voluntary German surrenders compared to the previous 6-week period. Interrogating officers noted that a significant number of these surrendering soldiers cited rumors of American treatment of prisoners as a primary factor in their decision. 40%. Not from a bombing campaign, not from a battlefield victory. From a tin soap dish and a bar of U.S. Army soap and 36 women who had been given back their mirrors. The battle that crystallized everything happened on February 23, 1945, the opening day of Operation Grenade. American forces under General William Simpson's 9th Army crossed the Roer River at 0330 hours. The crossing had been planned using in part the defensive position intelligence provided by Karl and his two companions 2 months earlier. 12 kilometers of German defensive installations along the river's eastern bank had been mapped with a precision that American planners had not possessed before December. The crossing was not clean. War is never clean. American engineers took fire on the water. 3 boats were lost in the first hour. 17 men died before dawn. But the German defensive response, which intelligence had predicted, would concentrate in 2 specific sectors, concentrated exactly where predicted. American artillery pre-positioned, based on Karl's information, was already aimed at those sectors when the German guns opened up. The response time was 11 minutes. In previous Roer crossing attempts, German defensive artillery had been operational for an average of 47 minutes before American counter-battery fire could be brought to bear. 11 minutes versus 47. That gap, 36 minutes of suppressed German fire, saved an estimated 200 to 300 American casualties in the opening hours of the assault. By 800 hours, 4 American divisions had established bridgeheads on the eastern bank. By noon, the first tanks were crossing on pontoon bridges. By February 28th, 5 days into the operation, American forces had advanced 30 kilometers into German territory and captured over 12,000 prisoners. German resistance along the pre-mapped sectors collapsed faster than any army planner had projected. General Simpson's after-action report noted that pre-operational intelligence proved decisive in reducing defensive response time and enemy unit cohesion along the primary axis of advance. And pre-operational intelligence. 3 men who walked 19 hours through snow because a woman in Oklahoma had written home honestly about hot water and soap. In barracks 3C. The women did not know the details of what had happened at the Roer. The war's specific geography was kept from them as regulations required. But in February 1945, Helen Baumgartner returned from a 2-day absence and walked into the barracks with a look on her face that Ilsa had never seen before. Not happiness exactly. Something older and quieter. "The letter program is being reinstated," Helen said. "Full access, monthly. And the farm labor program resumes next week." Nobody cheered. They had been in this place long enough to know that victories did not announce themselves loudly. Sabine simply nodded. Gertrude walked to Der Winkel, adjusted a small photograph, and said nothing. Erika pressed the picture of her son to her chest. That evening, Gertrude sat at the edge of her bunk and wrote a letter that she was not certain would ever be delivered. It was addressed to Karl wherever he was now in American custody. It was 3 sentences long. "You walk toward the right thing. I am proud of you. Keep walking." By March 1945, the voluntary German surrender rate along the Western Front had increased by 62% compared to the same period in 1944. American Army intelligence had formalized what they were now calling prisoner influence networks, the documented effect of POW treatment on enemy morale and defection rates. Camp Tonkawa was cited in 3 separate intelligence assessments as a primary data point. The women of Barracks 3C had become without ever holding a weapon, one of the most effective psychological operations assets in the American POW system. None of them would ever be told this directly. The official language would always be careful, distant, institutional. But Major Harrelson knew. Captain Faulkner knew. And Helen Baumgartner, who had spent months translating between 2 worlds, knew it better than anyone. She wrote in her private diary on March 15, 1945, 36 women changed the arithmetic of this war. Not by fighting, by being treated decently and telling the truth about it. The generals will take credit for the river crossing. History will record the bridge tonnage and the casualty figures. Nobody will mention the soap dish. The war in Europe would end in May 1945. The numbers that historians would eventually compile told a story of overwhelming military force Millions of men, thousands of aircraft, hundreds of thousands of tons of materiel. But buried inside those numbers and footnotes and declassified intelligence assessments released decades later was a smaller story. A story about a 40% increase in voluntary surrenders, about 3 men who walked through snow, about pre-operational intelligence that shortened a critical river crossing by 36 minutes, and about what began. It all 36 women, a shower hut in Oklahoma, and the radical act of being treated as human beings. But there is one part of this story that the history books have never fully told. What happened to these women? After the gates opened, what did they carry home? What did they build from the ruins of everything they had been forced to unlearn? And what did the town of Tonkawa, Oklahoma do with what they had witnessed? That chapter, the final one, is the one that changes everything you think you know about how wars actually end. 36 women had arrived in chains and terror. They had discovered mercy in a shower hut. They had built dignity from tin soap dishes and bent mirrors. They had written letters that convinced a soldier to walk 19 hours through snow. And those 3 men, Carl and his companions, had provided intelligence that helped shorten a critical river crossing by 36 minutes, saving an estimated 200 to 300 American lives at the rower. The women of Barracks 3C had become, without ever holding a weapon, one of the most quietly effective psychological operations in the Western theater of World War II. But now, the war was over. The gates would open. And the question nobody had thought to ask was the one that mattered most. What do you carry home when home no longer exists? The announcement came without ceremony. Major Harrelson walked into Barracks 3C on the morning of May 9th, removed his hat, and told them. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was finished. Transport would be arranged within weeks. They would be processed, documented, and repatriated through a holding facility in Bremen. Nobody cheered. Nobody wept. Sabine sat on the edge of her bunk and stared at her hands for a long time. Ilsa walked to the window and looked out at the Oklahoma prairie flat, enormous, indifferent, and felt something she had not expected. Not relief. Not joy. Something closer to grief. Because this place, this barbed wire rectangle of red dirt and donated blankets and out-of-tune piano music, had become the only location on Earth where she had felt safe in 6 years. And now she was being sent back to a country that existed only in rubble and shame. Helen Baumgartner spent the final 2 weeks processing paperwork during the day and sitting with the women in the evenings, not as a translator, but simply as a person who had been changed by the same experience that had changed them. On the last night, she sat in the chapel beside Gertrude, while Gertrude played Schumann one final time. When the last note faded, Helen said quietly, "You gave something to this country that it didn't know it needed." Gertrude kept her hands on the keys. "We gave it the truth about what we were. That is not a gift. That is simply what was owed." They left on the morning of May 23rd, the same dirt road, the same Oklahoma wind, but no chains, no silence born from terror. As the trucks moved toward the outer gate, Mabel Clayton stood at the roadside again, apron flour-dusted hands, arms crossed. Sabine leaned from the truck's edge. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. Mabel raised one hand. Sabine pressed her own hand flat against her chest over her heart. The trucks rounded the curve. The camp disappeared behind the tree line, and 36 women carried back across the Atlantic everything that Barracks 3C had given them. Not objects, not documents, but something harder to name and impossible to confiscate. The knowledge that an enemy had chosen to see them as human beings, and that they in turn had chosen to become worthy of that. What they returned to was devastation. Dresden, where Ilsa was from, had been firebombed into architecture that looked like broken teeth. Bremen Sabine's home had lost 40% of its residential buildings. Leipzig, Gertrude's city, sat in the Soviet occupation zone, a geography of uncertainty that would harden within years into a wall. Some women found family waiting. Others found graves. Several discovered that their homes had been occupied by refugees from the East, and no legal mechanism existed to reclaim them. A few faced social hostility from fellow Germans who had suffered in Europe while they had been, as some put it, bitterly vacationing in America. Ilse returned to a Hamburg neighborhood she no longer recognized. She found her mother alive, 71 years old, living in 2 rooms of a building that had lost its upper floors to bombing. She walked through the door carrying a single bag and the tin soap dish she had made from a discarded mess tin. Her mother touched her face with both hands and did not speak for a full minute. Then she said, "You look different." Ilse set the soap dish on the windowsill where the morning light could catch it. "I am different," she said. "I'll explain later." She never fully did. But her mother kept the soap dish on that windowsill for the remaining 11 years of her life. Sabine returned to Bremen and discovered that her parents' house was gone. She stayed with an aunt for 3 months, then found work as a secretary at a British administration office. Her wartime typing training originally intended to serve the Reich, now serving the occupation that had replaced it. She married in 1948. She had 2 daughters. She never spoke publicly about Camp Tonkawa, but every year on September 14th, the anniversary of their arrival, she placed a bar of soap on her kitchen windowsill and left it there for 1 day. Her daughters asked why eventually. She told them to remember that kindness exists even in the worst places, especially then. Gertrude entered the Soviet zone and disappeared from American records entirely. What became of her is not documented. Her name appears in a 1947 Red Cross registry as having registered for family reunification services in Leipzig. After that silence. Whether she found Karl, whether she ever heard what his 19-hour walk through snow had contributed to, nobody in the historical record can say with certainty. But Captain Faulkner, compiling his final Red Cross report in 1946, wrote one line about her that has survived in the archive. Of all the women in Barracks 3C, she understood most clearly what they had accomplished, and she asked for nothing in return. Major William Harrelson returned to Kentucky and opened a hardware store. He never gave interviews about Camp Tonkawa. He declined 2 invitations from academic researchers in the 1960s. When a local newspaper profiled him in 1971 on the 25th anniversary of the war's end, he said only this about his time commanding the camp. "We tried to treat people like people. I don't know why that was considered unusual." He died in 1979. His obituary mentioned his military service in 4 lines and devoted 3 paragraphs to his involvement in his local Methodist church's building fund. Captain Edward Faulkner returned to the University of Chicago and spent 30 years teaching a course called Institutions and Human Behavior. He published 3 academic papers directly drawing on his Camp Tonkawa experience, though he changed all names and locations per Red Cross confidentiality protocols. His 1952 paper, Behavioral Outcomes in Humane POW Administration, documented the 40% voluntary surrender increase correlated with prisoner treatment standards without ever naming the specific camp or individuals involved. It was cited in 17 subsequent military psychology studies and influenced the development of American POW handling doctrine through the Korean and Vietnam eras. Faulkner received no military decoration for his work at Tonkawa. He received a civilian academic award in 1967. He kept the original Red Cross inspection report, the one that buried Pratt's interference, framed on his office wall until he retired. His students sometimes asked what it was. Evidence he would say that the right thing and the smart thing are occasionally the same thing. Helen Baumgartner, the half-German, half-American translator who had stood in the truck's opening and said, "You are safe," to 36 terrified women stayed in Oklahoma. She married a farmer from Tonkawa in 1947. She taught German at the local high school for 22 years. Several of her former students interviewed decades later for a regional history project described her as the best teacher they had ever had. None of them knew what she had done during the war. She had not told them, but every one of them described the same quality in her teaching. She made you feel like what you said mattered, like your words had weight. The legacy of what happened in Barracks 3C moved through history quietly, the way that genuine things often do. The formal military record credited the intelligence gains from voluntary German surrenders in late 1944 and early 1945 to effective prisoner handling and strategic communication programs. The Roer River Crossing Operation Grenade is taught in military history courses as a logistical and tactical success. The pre-operational intelligence contribution is noted in footnotes. The origin of that intelligence. 3 men who walked through snow because a woman in Oklahoma had written honestly about hot water is not in the textbooks. But in 1987, the National Archives declassified a batch of Army intelligence documents from the Western European theater. Among them was Faulkner's 1944 assessment of Camp Tonkawa, finally named and dated and attributed. A military historian at the University of Oklahoma named Dr. Patricia Renner, who in a coincidence that feels too precise to be accidental, shared a surname with Ilse Renner of Barracks 3C, discovered the document during routine archival research. She spent 4 years tracing the chain of events from the shower hut in September 1944 to Carl's defection in November to the Roer Crossing in February 1945. Her 1991 monograph, The Tonkawa Effect, documented for the first time the complete causal chain. It sold modestly. It won a regional history award. It was reviewed in 2 academic journals, and in the display case of a small museum in Tonkawa, Oklahoma, alongside a folded letter and a cracked mirror and a yellowed sheet of music. There now sits a single object, that doctor. Renner tracked down through 40 years of inheritance and estate sales and a retired farmer's attic in Hamburg, Germany. A tin soap dish, bent at the corners, scratched with age, cleaned carefully. And beside it, a card in handwritten English that reads, "Made from a discarded mess tin, hammered flat with a rock behind a latrine, by a woman who thought soap shouldn't sit in the dirt." Here is the final truth of this story. 36 women entered a camp in Oklahoma having been taught that their enemy was a monster. They were given hot water and folded towels. They were given blankets by women who had buried sons. They were given a Bible by a stranger in Tulsa who wrote, "May peace reach you before war does again." They were given mirrors that showed them their own faces. And they were given slowly and perfectly, without ceremony, the rarest thing that war ever produces. Time to become someone different from who they had been trained to be. That transformation produced measurable outcomes. A 40% increase in voluntary enemy surrenders. Pre-operational intelligence that reduced American casualties at a critical river crossing. A psychological operations model that influenced POW doctrine for decades. 3 men who walked 19 hours through frozen ground because they believed on the word of one woman's letter that the people on the other side of the wire were worth surrendering to. But the number that matters most is not 40%. It is not 200 to 300 lives saved at the Roer. It is not the 17 military psychology studies that cited Faulkner's paper. The number that matters most is 36. 36 ordinary women secretaries, nurses, telephone clerks, a banker, a seamstress from Munich with clever fingers who were treated as human beings at the precise moment when nobody was required to treat them that way. And who responded, as human beings almost always do when given the chance, by becoming more than what fear had made them. Mate, wars are ended by armies, but they are finished, truly lastingly finished, by something quieter. By a widow in an apron handing lemonade to an enemy. By a translator standing in a truck doorway saying you are safe. By a woman hammering a soap dish flat with a rock because she believed that even here, even now, things should be done with care. The barbed wire fence at Camp Tonkawa came down in 1946. The barracks were demolished. The chapel was converted to a grain storage facility and later torn down. The piano was sold at auction for $11. But something built inside those walls in the fall and winter of 1944 did not come down with the fence. It walked out through the gate in the hands of 36 women. It crossed the Atlantic. It survived the rubble and the Soviet zone and the silence of people who could not find words for what they had experienced. It sits now in a museum case in a small Oklahoma town shaped like a soap dish, dented at the corners, absolutely honest. And it proves the only thing in this entire story that was never in doubt, that decency given freely to the undeserving is the only kind that changes anything.